right, welcome everybody. I appreciate you being with us today. My name is Andy Purcell. I think I've probably met most of you here or there at some sort of an event or other. But we'll be able to spend some time together today talking about moving to the cloud, and is it the right thing for you and what the timing is. And at the end, there will be a time for questions. So if you have any questions, you can use the question or the chat feature here. And we'll talk about that a bit at the end. And hopefully you can get something out of this. Hopefully get some ideas about moving forward and how we're able to work better in the cloud, and it can benefit everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. We have done a version of this presentation in the past, but the cloud world has changed just about as fast as the cybersecurity and the regular IT environment as a whole has been changing over the past couple of years. So it's a big time for us to go back and take a look at cloud. What does that mean? What did it used to mean? Who's not in the cloud? I mean, whether you know it or not. So that's some of what we're gonna talk about. I would expect this probably to go 30, 40 minutes, depending upon questions. So it should not be one of the lengthier presentations, and save you a little bit of time during your lunch hour. So what is common cloud usage today? Everybody wants to know, what does the cloud mean? Am I in it? Is it painful? Those kinds of things. If you're doing Google Drive, if you're doing Dropbox, if you're using any of those things for personal or business uses, you're in the cloud. We certainly here at TCS are a Microsoft shop. So when we talk about using OneDrive, we talk about using Azure, we talk about all of those related tools, SharePoint being sort of the third leg of that stool. Those are all cloud applications. So those are kind of easy. We recognize that. We know that is in the cloud. Email, I would say 50 to 60%, if not greater at this point, and growing each day, of people are putting email at Office 365. Others are doing G Suite from Google. There are a few more that are out there that are less well-known, less common, less popular. But that is all email in the cloud. It makes life a lot easier. You could be sitting on the beach and getting email if you choose to do that. You certainly could be sitting in your office, as we've done traditionally. You can use the Outlook client, or you can use what they used to call OWA, which is the web interface. So all of your email then is in the cloud, unless you save it locally, unless at that point you do archive it and choose to do that in a local sense. Banking and financial services. Every time you log into your banking website, you log into your portal, all of that's in the cloud. And if you sort of follow that string, anytime that you save a TV show, if you're using something like YouTube TV or something like that, it's being done in the cloud. Obviously, if you're with the cable company, have a DVR, it's being done to the hard drive there locally. But a lot of the other stuff is being saved to the cloud. Is you're going out and checking all of your information for your phone service. That's data that's in the cloud because it's residing on their side, and they probably have put it in a data center, so it is truly in the cloud, even from their perspective. So as we think about what is cloud-based today, most of what we do is social networking. They are applications where you're sending data up to them, whether it's pictures, whether it's posts, whatever it might be. And whether they have their own data center or whether they've outsourced that data is still living somewhere off-site from our perspective. So again, we're already have been in the cloud. Backup services, I mentioned Dropbox, I mentioned a multitude of the other ones that we're using personally and from a business standpoint. All of that is cloud-based by definition. I know when you put something, whether it is it Azure or whether it's with Google, whether it's with Amazon, or a number of the smaller applications that are out there, all of that stuff is usually backed up, again, themselves, to make sure that you have the redundancy in that. So yes, we're all in the cloud. We all have been. We're never escaping from it. So as we go through this presentation, there are a few things that I want us to talk about as we're keeping that in mind. I want to review the email strategies. At this point, your options are more and more limited than they have been in the past. But I do want to make sure as we talk about those, that everybody understands that there are still some options. We want to also identify which applications are well suited for the cloud, and which ones, conversely, which ones aren't. The third piece, same thing with data. All data is not designed for the cloud. All data is not a great fit. And so what can you and what can't you move at that point? So those data types are going to be important. Security. Security is in many ways more important in the cloud because there's a degree of control that we are sacrificing for that convenience. Though realistically, probably Microsoft, Google, and Amazon have much greater security than we could ever put in place here locally for us. But we must have some kind of security plan in place. And then there are some other considerations that we'll just kind of pile together and cover them as we go. But that's sort of what's going to take us through the next little bit of our conversation here today. So email, when we began doing cloud presentations and cloud discussions, we would say, is your email in-house? And most everyone would raise their hand. Today, again, conservatively, I'll throw out that 50 or 60% number. I really suspect it's higher than that. It's almost rare when I walk into a new engagement with a potential client and they're doing anything other than 365 or G Suite from Google. But it is certainly possible. One of those considerations is, do you have a legal hold? If you are in, I think the legal industry is the biggest one, but there's certainly others where it applies. How long do you have to hang on to that information? You also have governance issues, compliance issues. HIPAA in the medical industry is a giant one that comes to mind that everybody thinks of first. But legal has retention of their own. And certainly in the financial services industry, you have to document everything for safety on both sides. So as we look at where does your email sit today, if it is not already in the cloud, that is probably a good first step if you haven't done it. Ease of access is first and foremost. Second, there is greater security in most cases by doing that and putting it in the cloud, putting it at 365 or with Google. I would say that the next reason at that point is you're going to get rid of being tied to local hardware. When we're having Exchange servers and we're replacing them on a periodic basis, that's something you no longer have to do. So as we look at email, those are really the main considerations as we go into that aspect. The apps that you run let's begin with the simple ones, your Office applications, Word, Excel, the PowerPoint that we're looking at here. All of those are available through Office 365. I think that's probably where most people are getting them today, though not everybody. It's not quite as ubiquitous as what we're seeing on the mail side. But if you're not already doing it, something to consider. It's a perpetual license. You don't have to keep purchasing it. Again, you don't have some of the on-site considerations that you do. So as we start things like that, to start your business, your productivity applications, that's a great first place for those who are not already there. You want to also take a look at what can be run outside of your network in a WAN environment where you're putting some of the cloud, whether you're storing it at Azure, whether you're spinning up a VM offsite somewhere, whether it's a data center from a third party, any of those things. Not all applications run as well as others. Certainly database applications are an example of things that might not be a great fit for that type of environment. We'll talk about that in a moment with remote desktop. An example for some of these cloud services would be if you've got a database application or if you're moving documents back and forth on a regular basis. Think about a law firm with how much collaboration they're doing, how many times they save that application. Think about something in the government side or in building using CAD drawings or some sort of very, very large files. Most of those services are going to charge you per gigabyte for transmitting the data. So if you've got multiple gigs of data you're transmitting every day, then that's not as good a fit as if you're making slight changes to an application. So that's something to consider as we're looking at, is your app a fit or not? Remote desktop, that's another layer that we've used for years and years, but you can also use that in conjunction with cloud. Again, not everything plays well there, but it's a type of option to consider, whether it is at one of the big three or whether you're putting it in a private data center. It's something to consider that can allow you to access applications maybe not designed natively for it, but we can use them as a way to get you there. And then I would say that the other issues running in a virtual environment. Running your VMs locally is no different than running them in the cloud. In the cloud, it really becomes requirement might be a strong word, but certainly becomes a preferable way to do it. Virtual desktops. We have rolled out our first couple of projects related to virtual desktops. So you're sitting at your machine. It could be the laptop you use in the rest of your life, or it could be what we would consider in the old days more of a dumb terminal, just a machine that you only do use for accessing these virtual desktops. And then they would then live in the cloud. You would operate off of them, and it's a much more cost effective because it is a small number of dollars per month for a virtual desktop as opposed to going out and buying hardware each time. So it's another consideration as we take a look at what types of applications and even hardware are going to be a good fit for moving wholly and solely to the cloud. We mentioned a little bit about data, and I think that's one of the keys that you want to look at. What type of data is it? How much do you have? What do you do with it? How often do you access it? So if you're in a law firm and all you need is to go back and look at cases, once a year that might be relevant to something you're doing in a new case today, that's kind of a no-brainer. That's something you put in the cloud. You get off your local devices. You get off your in-house servers and solely move that to the cloud. That same law firm, however, might have a document management system where they're constantly transmitting documents and changes back and forth. That might not be as good a fit, or maybe there's a hybrid approach there that we take, and you store them locally, or maybe you do them in SharePoint rather than going to a full Azure environment and development. So that's where a SharePoint might be a better fit in that type of environment. And there are lots of others in between. Medical, you look at patient data, but if they only come to visit once every 6 months for a checkup, maybe you don't need to access that quite as quickly, as opposed to financial services where you're making changes and trades on a daily basis. So the type of data that you have and how much of your data are also things that are going to be relevant to your decision as far as what type of cloud environment you go to. The next consideration is how you access it. We talked a little bit about that in the sense of the transit of the data, but also is this data something that you're going to access solely from a PC or a laptop within your office environment? Is this something where you're going to work over a VPN from home at night, or just because you like working from home? And so it changes how you're going to access that data. Is it a different machine? Is it simply a laptop that goes back and forth? And then there's that data for the person who is on vacation, or a person who travels, who is out of the office, but not in a set location like their home, maybe working from hotels and airports and that kind of thing. So that brings in the security component that we can look at in a few minutes. But there are lots of considerations to take into account as we move forward together. And then from a user perspective, okay, what are they going to need access to? And it's kind of the same things we just talked about. Your users work solely from the office? Do they work from home? Do they travel? Okay. Do they need a subset of your data? Obviously, not every user in your organization is going to be looking at financial data. So do they just need a CRM system? Do they need an ERP system? Do they have patient or client management software in a medical environment? Is it document management, like we mentioned, for attorneys? Are you in your manufacturing where you are looking at that ERP, MRP data? So part of that is what are they looking at? Is it suited for working remotely? Is it suited for having a cloud-based application where you're making changes to fields as opposed to shipping off large documents or images or CAD data? So those are the other bits of consideration when you look at data. There are a lot of pieces that are unique to every company. And frankly, that's why we sit down and do an assessment of the needs before anybody moves to cloud, because we're not created equal in every case. Security. I mean, this is the hot topic in our world, should be in most everybody's world also these days. And it changes. It's lightning fast as far as the pace at which things change and the evolution. I think some of the things we're doing today for security that you never would have thought of before. The notion of walking into an environment and seeing somebody without a firewall, it's almost shocking from our perspective these days, because there's so much open access to anybody with the right sort of tools and the wrong sort of mentality. I think also you want to take a look at how many organizations out there might just have a router from their ISP, and they're depending upon that. And in fact, that's probably there as much to protect the ISP or the internet provider than it is to protect the end user or the client. So as we want to take a look at these, you've got to determine how willing you are to go all in for security. And there's a phrase that we've used as long as I've been in this field, and it actually, the phrase is that your security, the effectiveness of security, is in an inverse relationship with convenience. And that simply means the more secure you're going to be, the less convenient it's going to be. So gone are the days, we hope, of writing down passwords on sticky notes and putting them on monitors or on your laptop. But certainly there's a middle ground where we can be functional and we can work, and we're not having to enter a 20-digit character every time we log in. But the flip side of that is maintaining a security posture that keeps us out of trouble. So as we think about passwords, password keepers and the various ones of those these days are a nice solution to help with that middle ground. I can have 20-character passwords, but I put it into my my password keeping tool, and all I have to do is to log into it a single time. It then accesses those longer, rather arduous passwords if we had to type them in manually. So that's a way that we can sort of mitigate some of that inconvenience and still have the full security that we all need. Audit logging, or looking at the audit trails, looking at some of the SIM logging procedures that we come up with, and they're evolving as security evolves. Our TCS Cyber Shield product has some great logging functionality in there. And one of the reasons you want to do that is to find out what kind of access, what's been going on behind the scenes, who's trying to get in, are you having DOS attacks and things like that, that you might not know without looking at the logging. Now, individually, we would go nuts and have no time for anything else if we sifted through all these logs ourselves, which is why we're using these tools and the applications to do that for us. And it's become a key feature of the security, and maybe more so in the cloud. Passwords probably are equally important in both cases. Having some of the logging or the tracking for cloud-based applications might be more important, because if somebody's going to be trying to get in there, you're not going to see it maybe as readily as you would with an in-house server. So I would say that the logging and the tracking and then the auditing of those logs is probably more critical with the cloud than it would be on site. Last piece, MFA, and probably everyone knows what MFA is, but it ranges from the most common, and somebody has to get a pop-up saying, we're going to send you a code and please enter that in. There's certainly, Google and Microsoft both have MFA tools that you have on your phone. It's not even a text, it's through their little application. And you're able to put in that password that rotates every 60 seconds, maybe it's 5 minutes, whatever the rotation is that you set up. So MFA has become very, very important. It began in the simple days. I remember logging into my bank, and I would log in, I would see my name, and I would see a picture. A picture could be of a soccer ball or an apple tree. It doesn't matter what the picture was, but I would need to identify what that item was, and then it matched with my account and with my password. So MFA has evolved a long way since those days. There certainly are multiple ways to do it. If you remember back when we used to call it dual factor authentication, and so we've gone to MFA because usually there are more than just two ways to check who you are. And then you're able to save some of the data. If you're using the same machine and it's unique to that device, you can use the same kind of concept of saving those. Just an aside here, not necessarily cloud related, but encryption on laptops. Certainly it's great to be able to use those automatic logins, whether it's for a cloud application or local, but you need to also encrypt that data so that if you leave it in a cab while you're on the road, nobody else can get into it and access your applications. But again, I think in the cloud, things like that, taking the extra step with the MFA is as critical, or in many cases more so, than what you would do with an on-premise server. simply because you're accessing the data in another physical location. So highly recommend MFA. If you're not doing it, shame on you. And let's get that set up immediately. Some of the other items that we want to consider as we go through these, and I'm sure we could come up with this list and probably name 10 more, and you probably have more ideas on top of that. But just to think about, do you have a phone system that sends out emails when voicemails are left? So there's several steps in there that you're going to want to consider if you're using a system like that. As you want to put that application in the cloud, we want to make sure to account for those kinds of things. If you're concerned about accessing that cloud data from free Wi-Fi, I mean, the example is always Starbucks, right? But it could be McDonald's. It could be you're seeing a play at the Tanger Center. It could be anything where you're on free Wi-Fi provided by a venue that you're attending an event or dining or whatever it is. That's where we want to take a look at potentially using VPNs for that traffic. The example that everybody uses at Starbucks is there's a guy sitting back there with the pineapple, and he's routing the traffic through there and collecting everybody's incoming data, purporting to be the server there at Starbucks or whoever they're using. But in fact, as that information is coming through his connection, he's skimming off the data from wherever you're going and visiting. If it's sports scores, whether it's your bank, whatever it may be. So I think one key as we look into here that also dovetails with security is we want to make sure that there are VPNs in place so that your folks who are accessing that data in the cloud can do so securely, because you can't always control where they're sitting. Also, the question, what happens if the internet goes down? I would say this is a double-edged sword, right? If the internet goes down, you probably have lots of issues going on in your environment or your organization. Not just can you reach the cloud server. But even from that, the luxury that having an application in the cloud gives you to work remotely is also the blessing in the sense that you're going to go out and find somewhere remote that you can then access a server, even if you've had a power outage or the internet is down in your office or your environment where you work. So, that does cut both ways. If you can send employees home to work, if they can go use that VPN and go to Starbucks, that kind of thing, you're able to mitigate the danger of the internet goes down. And in some cases, it's even more accessible if you're using a cloud-based application than you would be in the office if somebody cuts the internet line or you have a power problem. So I think in some cases, we're gonna call this one a wash, because you're going to be able to work from other places and not have downtime. Another thing to consider, are you using an email or scanning application where you're scanning to a folder or you're scanning it and sending it to your email? Those servers and those applications that do that sort of work can absolutely live in the cloud on an Azure server, just like you would locally. But it's definitely something to consider as you go through the process. Once you move to the cloud, it's those things that sometimes get left behind and not thought about. But we want to make sure to include that, just like we're doing with your email to voicemail with voice to text. So there may be something else that you're doing the same kind of thing. Maybe you've got time card applications. Maybe you're booking time, billing time to clients, things like that. If you've got separate applications for that, they need to make sure we're including those in the project. And then the last one here on this page is, don't just assume that because things are in the cloud that they're more secure and that your backups are sufficient. So it's where we talk about adding MFA. It's where we're talking about adding a VPN. All those things that are between you and the cloud are where the variability come in. If you're at Microsoft using Azure, and presumably the same thing if you're at Google with their cloud, they're going to have incredible security of the data when it's with them. As it's in transit, as it's leaving your organization, that's where we've got to lock down those areas as well. So it's firewall, it's MFA, it's making sure our password structure is solid. Backups are another good question. When you look at those providers, they are typically going to have a primary and a secondary location, but it certainly doesn't hurt you to ask about third-party backups, and maybe having a third-party backup makes sense depending on how secure and necessary your information is. Maybe it isn't for that thing you check once every few years or once a month. I would suggest that it is probably critical if you're in one of those professions, legal, medical, and then financial, where you have requirements hanging on the data for a certain amount of time, I would look at third-party applications even to back up the cloud data. And that's typically not very expensive, but it can be very critical if there is an issue. And certainly there's always the potential of something occurring. So we've talked about a lot of different industries, and there's some slightly different planning options for them. And obviously, you only work in one industry. So as we go through these, and they're not going to apply to everybody. But if we think about manufacturing, here's another one of those little things to keep in mind. If you're using a barcode scanner on a shop floor, for example, that's something that the application can reside in the cloud, but you don't want to forget to discuss that along the way. All right, just like you're scanning, you're texting, and your voice to text. This kind of environment too, what happens if the internet is down? This one's a little different because if some of the shop floor applications go down, you can't send those guys home to work remotely, right? So there it is more critical. So things like looking at secondary connections. If you're with one provider, look at another provider. It doesn't have to be fiber. It doesn't have to be the fastest thing in the world. Just has to be something that can keep you up and running if the internet goes down. Obviously, if it's a complete power outage, that's not going to be very applicable. But things in manufacturing where you can't send employees home, that's going to be important. If you do have a stop to production, that's costing you money for the first minute, not only from lost production, but also paying salaries of guys who aren't there. So take a look at those things in the manufacturing industry. If you go down, how do you get around that? If production is going to stop, let's make sure to have a secondary connection. Make sure we have ways to stay up and running, even if you do have an outage. Financial and legal. We talked a little bit about legal hold, and the one that I've dealt with just yesterday, as a matter of fact, law firm has a policy they want to hang on to data, depending on what it is, for 7 to 10 years and what type of case it is. That's important. There is a legal hold function within 365 for Microsoft. There are legal holds of different types on different types of data. And that may be a case where some of that we do archive off into slower storage that takes longer to access, but you're not paying nearly so much per gig for that. And if you don't have a legal hold that's required, is it maybe something you want to institute just for the sake of keeping that data and your own record keeping? So that's something that's going to vary a little bit by segment to segment, but those are some options that you could look at. And one of those is, I think about particularly these two, a lot of those are now using web-based applications where they're not keeping as much data on site because the providers and the manufacturers of that software have a cloud-based option. And so that's something else to consider. Insurance is another one. It's kind of that hybrid where you have some legal issues. You certainly have some financial issues. Depending on the types of insurance, you're insuring people's homes, their property, their cars, things like that. Some things are going to impact you there. So, mobility is big. You have agents that are in the field all of the time. I mean, if they're not in the field, they're not doing their job. So they're going to be able to have a need for cloud-based applications, just like that employee that works at home. So it's going to be critical for them. And then how do you access it? Security is going to be a huge part of that too. If they're working at a restaurant or something, then they're going to need to have that VPN. If they're accessing it remotely from a client site, they're not going to control the network they're on. So at that point, it becomes important again that you have MFA put in place. Your passwords are very secure. Use the password keeper applications. And then you also take a look at the applications from the carriers that you work with. Some of them, I suggest, maybe most of them at this point, do have web-based applications that they can access simply with internet. But there may be some that are still running physical applications. Do we need to look at remote desktop in those cases? So can they live in the cloud, but maybe they live on an RDP server? So things like that, just because of the mobility and the way insurance is done with agents that are in the field. Medical is always, it's fun. And some of these will apply not only to medical, but to others. If you have multiple branches, you may have a retail operation with multiple branches. Is that all coming back to a central server, which may be sitting in your on premise today, maybe in the cloud tomorrow, but it's still a single server. or do each of them work on their own? If they're on their own, it's a little bit different environment. Perhaps they need to have their own VM in the cloud somewhere. So those are things to consider, again, not only for medical, but anybody who has multiple branches. And then they talk about HIPAA as like the test case, or it is the best example of compliance or governance that needs to be maintained, monitored, and managed. And in many cases, the Microsofts of the world do provide you some of that HIPAA requirement just by being on their site from a security standpoint and everything else. It takes one more thing off of your shoulders that you don't have to manage. So, it's definitely something to take a look at and look at the type of data that a medical practice would have, but may be a very good example of somebody who is suited, whereas 5 years ago, maybe they weren't. And as we begin to execute our plan, regardless of industry, regardless of strategy, regardless of where you're putting your data or using for your cloud provider, we want to go through and take a look at several of these other areas, right? So you want to take a look at the plan that you're on. We talked about the way data is structured by many of these providers, in that it's the data that's in flight or in transit is how they test and how they will bill you. You do also want to look at the security strategy, and there are questions to ask of each of these providers. The larger the provider, the better that security is going to be. So if you're using somebody else in more of a niche, or if you're using an applications provided cloud service, important to ask them about their own security posture and strategy. Also, we look at, we talked a moment ago, within each industry and within each set of unique compliance or governance needs, make sure that it's allowed, make sure it's permitted, make sure you know what the requirements are. Then you can communicate those to the provider, or you can search for a provider that fits them. Again, Microsoft is one that has made a point of hitting those governance mileposts or thresholds so that they do meet those needs. You need to plan the migration project. You're moving data from one place to another, just like we used to move them from one server to a new server in the on-site days or methods. So that project is probably going to be very similar in scope, in size, and in cost, but it definitely is something to take a look at. And it's a component that might help you make a decision one way or the other. And then, of course, ongoing support. Now, that is support from the provider like Microsoft or Google. It is support from your applications if you're using a web-based application of a current application. And then, obviously, that's something that TCS helps with. So we're able to provide you that support. We're able to be that liaison to your application provider or host. As long as you're on a concurrent support or maintenance with them, we're able to speak to them on your behalf. So we're going to take care of that support for you. And for those who are still looking at or considering a move and going to the cloud, this is where you have a company like TCS, and hopefully you'll have confidence in us to allow us to come in and do a security review or an assessment of your applications, not the network so much at this point, but come in and review where you are with your data, what types, what security you have, what plans, what your needs are, what the access looks like, all the things we discussed today. Those are areas where we want to come in and look at how to move you to the right platform. Again, whether it is an application from a manufacturer, whether that is fully to the cloud at Azure, or whether there's something in the middle of a hybrid approach where we use some resources on site. Maybe we leverage SharePoint to store documents, so we're not moving documents back and forth to Azure, for example. But that's what we do in our cloud reviews. Usually someone like me will come in with an engineer and really give you an assessment of what you're looking at with your data and how we can effectively move it to somewhere that's safer, better, and more productive going forward. So questions, if anybody has them, please raise a hand, use the question or the chat function. I think there's both chat and Q&A. Feel free to use either or both, and I'd be more than happy to answer questions as we go forward. And I do have the first one. Looks like there are a couple here. We'll go through those. If more come in, fine. If not, you can approach us individually. And the first one is around SharePoint and how it differs from Microsoft or Google and Azure and those sorts of what we think of as cloud applications. SharePoint is a repository. It's a great place to store data. It's a collaborative tool. We can use SharePoint, you think about it, in a legal environment where people are making changes to case documents and case files. You can use that and work in a collaborative sense where it still is going to live on that server. You're not actually bringing it to your hard drive and making changes. So there absolutely is a cloud component to that. But think of it, rather than being application driven, it is more driven by documentation. So that'd be the first example. All right, and then we did the next one. You said the cloud is actually more secure, and what makes it so. It's where some of that additional security comes from the providers themselves. Mr. Gates and his guys are going to spend a lot more money and put a lot of more effort than we could possibly put into most people's own site security. Certainly, you've got some human factors that are in there. You've got access control getting into the facility, things like that. And at a cloud facility through Google or Microsoft, that access is going to be severely restricted to a much smaller percentage of the organization's employees. It may still be hundreds of people at a group the size of Microsoft, but the percentage of folks getting in there is much smaller than most of your people who can walk into a server room. Okay, I think also if you look at the data itself, removing it from your own site server removes the concern of somebody getting into your environment, bots trying to find open ports like you'd see in the old days. It eliminates some of the, like I talked about, the human engineering component. And then also they're going to enforce, in most cases, multi-factor authentication, so that rather than you using it and some people being, using it and less committed and let's put it in place with employees, but not management, those kinds of things, it's going to be required. Next, those providers can provide you with Azure VPN, for instance. So you have a way or a secure tunnel to get into your data, even if you have not put VPNs in place locally. So those are just the first few. I'm sure there are many more that folks brighter than me could give you at a higher level. So I would say feel free to contact your CSM or some of our analysts that you've worked with. But just off the bat, that's 2 or 3 examples of ways that I find it's both secure, more secure in the physical sense, as well as in data access. And then I think in the long term, it is somebody else managing that for you who has a vested interest in their business fails. Imagine if Microsoft or Google got breached to the point where they're losing people's data, their days as the hosting service are basically over. So I think that fear or concern on their part is probably a great motivator to keeping it safe on their side. So. All right, unless I see you in any other questions, we'll go ahead and break. Again, thank you all so much. Please contact us. You can contact me directly. You can contact your CSM if you have one here at TCS. Phone numbers are there at the bottom of the screen, along with the info email address, and that will find its way to me, and then I can then direct it to the proper person. But thank you for your time today. Wish you good luck in your cloud journey, wherever you are in it. And I look forward to having success stories to hear the next time we get along with one of these presentations. So thank you.